Well, good afternoon. As you can see, change of background. No more green screen. Don't worry, it'll be back at some point, but I needed the space. I've been quite busy with getting back to the normal swing of doing gigs and stuff. So I'll say I've had all sorts of things going on. I've built a pergola, complete with a solid roof, metal roof, and it's taken quite a long time, but that's done. You can see some nice guitars behind me there, and I know quite a lot of you play guitar, so you'll be quite interested in the Adam Black acoustic, the vintage SG, the vintage Fender Telecaster, and the vintage jazz bass. Sorry, no, it's a Squire jazz bass, just as the dogs decide to leave my side and go wandering off. Oh well, at least that's them finished making their noise for the afternoon, hopefully. They should just go and lie down. They've been on a long walk. Now, obviously, this coming Monday is the 31st. So, of course, we always remember Teresa Halbach on the walk that I take the dogs. There is a tree set back in the sort of brush and everything, and there's still a bit of blue tape around it to remind me of Teresa. But the thing is, 2005, we're coming up to 2022. My goodness, that's 17 years ago that Teresa disappeared. And of course, we still don't know what happened to her. The likelihood is, I would say that with everything that I've seen so far, the most likely scenario is the one that Kathleen Zellner is presenting, that she was attacked at the back of her RAV4. The blood spatter explains that, and it is Teresa's blood. Could it be staged? Possibly. You know, the other problem was always the Carmen Bootwell situation. And also at one point, it was getting quite exciting, the thought that Teresa St. Jean Crockett, other side of the border, Teresa, with an interest in photography, could be her. But I believe there's discrepancy in height, which is a big problem, you know. So for me, the likelihood is that yes, on the 31st of October 2005, she was attacked and murdered the back of her trailer, and was then, it's quite gruesome to think about it, was dismembered and the remains burnt in a burn barrel in order to arrive at that cremated condition of the bones. Huge problems though, none of the torso, 2 teeth, which to most people have never been correctly aligned with those of Teresa. And I must admit, I'm tended obviously to agree with Dr. Siltman that the DNA in that they've got of this blood obviously points to Teresa, and other DNA that they've got that they took of the bones would suggest that it's Teresa, although they don't match all the loci or whatever it is. Dr. Siltman is pretty, is adamant that yes, they are Teresa's. And you know, you've got to sometimes use that sort of Occam's razor when you're looking at this. And although there are some other theories that could explain, certainly Teresa was never killed is a theory that is popular because it would explain so much that seems difficult to get our heads around. But assuming that it is, as I say, Teresa that was murdered on the 31st of October 2005, quite possibly at the end of Cuss Road. Then the question is, well, who? I suppose in descending order of likelihood, we've got obviously Steve and Brendan. They are the least likely. In fact, from what I've seen of following this case since 2016, that's 6 years now, I've yet to see anything that would ever change my opinion. In fact, everything that's come out since 2016 that I've seen has only confirmed further our belief. I'm speaking to the vast majority, 99.9% of the people out there who are also similarly convinced that Steve and Brendan had absolutely nothing to do with the disappearance of Teresa. So they are the least likely. Then we've got obviously Daniel contrasts his aliens. Could have been them. Not likely. Then you get into the real sort of possibilities. Ryan Hilgas, Scott Blowdorn. People are obviously looking at them with great suspicion. You've got the, I believe it's the German. You've got a Spanish-sounding fellow. But then we get to the real nitty-gritty of obviously, and by the way, along with Steve and Brendan, I also would discount Chuck and Earl. I don't believe they've had anything to do with it either. And Bob, of course. But Bob's husband, Scott Taddick, very, very suspicious. He's the one that Stephen Avery named himself in the phone call, said not so much Bobby, but the other one. And his glee at not just Stephen Avery being found guilty, but the smirk on his face when Brendan is found guilty. Very troubling. Bobby Dassey, we simply need to know the extent to his lies. Could he have been involved in it? Absolutely. Is he involved in the framing of Steve? Absolutely. If there's any dubiety there. But for me, of course, the painfully obvious fact is the fact that Kasurek and Vogel, due to be deposed, 2 years ago, is missing. If they didn't do it themselves, Kenneth Peterson didn't do it, Robert Herman didn't do it, they got others to do their bidding. Of that, there surely is no doubt. How far up the food chain does the cover-up go, and the assistants go? We just don't know. It's just depends on how corrupt everything is over there in Manitowoc, in Wisconsin in general. But anyway, obviously, our thoughts go to Teresa's family at this time, that the fact that she is no longer with us. But I'm afraid I do have still have suspicions about Mike and Ryan. And, you know, again, it could just be that they are involved simply in the helping to frame Stephen Brendan. But I don't think that's a really good thing to do, you know, for the memory of your sister. Anyway, let's have a look at, we stopped at page 24, and so let's carry on then with the next part of the appeal by Kathleen Zellner, which of course the state have until, I believe, the beginning of December to respond. They might respond earlier, but they asked to be given until the beginning of December, and that was of course granted by Sukovich. So let's call up where we got to. And it says page 24 of 100. the actual written part of this doesn't really go on quite that far. We got as far as obviously the Denny test, and this is the second part of the Denny test. This is paragraph 53. Item B, Bobby's opportunity to commit the murder of Teresa Holbach. And now, again, I just want to reiterate that even Kathleen Zellner is not saying Bobby did it. She's pointing out that the trial of Stephen was completely flawed by the fact that Dean and Jerry were not allowed to present any other Denny suspects. And Ken Kratz knew that that would be a problem for him. And that's why, obviously, and the Sheriff's Department, that is why they tried to make sure that there was no chance of any other suspects being put forward by Dean and Jerry. And at the time they were successful, I believe everything is beginning to unravel. Anyway, the second prong of the Denny test, the opportunity prong, asks, could the alleged third-party perpetrator have committed the crime directly or indirectly? In other words, does the evidence create a practical possibility that the third party committed the crime? 54. As a legal concept, opportunity appears in the Wisconsin statutes in the context of other acts evidence. 2. Other crimes, wrongs, or acts. Evidence of other crimes, wrongs, or acts is not admissible to prove the character of a person in order to show that the person acted in conformity therewith. This subsection does not exclude the evidence when offered for other purposes, such as proof of motive, opportunity, intent, preparation, plan, knowledge, identity, or absence of mistake or accident. Emphasis added. The case law, as well as Statute 90404, permits the introduction of other acts evidence to show a person's, whether a party or third party, opportunity to engage in certain conduct. Opportunity is a broad term. Proof of opportunity may be relevant to place the person at the scene of the offence, time and proximity, or to prove whether one had the requisite skills, capacity, or ability to carry out an act. It is incumbent on the proponent, however, to show the relevance of the opportunity evidence. According to the trial court, Mr. Avery's trial defense counsel has already established that Bobby had the opportunity to commit the murder of Miss Holbach. The Sawinski evidence greatly strengthens the opportunity argument because Bobby is in possession of Teresa's vehicle, where her murder likely occurred. Bobby's access to items of evidence to frame Steve. Additionally, the defense theory was that Mr. Avery was framed by evidence being planted in Teresa's car and Steve's trailer and burn barrel. The Sawinski evidence that Bobby was in possession of Teresa's vehicle provides the opportunity / access to the items that were used, quote, in the frame-up. The specific items that were planted and used in the frame-up of Mr. Avery were obviously Steve's own blood in the vehicle, Teresa's RAV4 key in the bedroom, and Teresa's electronic devices in Steve's burn barrel. So Bobby had access to Steve's blood. Steve told law enforcement in a recorded interview that his finger, which had been cut open prior to October the 31st, 2005, rebled on November the 3rd, 2005, and dripped blood in his bathroom sink and on the bathroom floor. In Mr. Avery's trial, Rowley Johnson, the owner of Steve's trailer, testified that he observed that the cut on Steve's finger was present prior to October the 31st. Mr. Avery consistently expressed his belief to his attorneys and the media that his blood found in Teresa's vehicle was planted and that it came from his bathroom sink. And of course, the other sort of side note there is the fact that the next morning, when he discovered the blood had been cleaned up, although the blood had been cleaned up, the person doing the cleaning had left a strong smell of smoking, which is most interesting because for a non-smoker, the smell of cigarettes are immediately detectable, whereas to a smoker, they would never notice the difference between a room with or without cigarette smoke smell in it. Anyway, Steve's claim that he bled into his bathroom sink and on the floor was corroborated by the fact that law enforcement found some of his blood around his bathroom sink and on his bathroom floor. In the early evening of November 2005, November 3rd, 2000, Sergeant Andrew Colburn, Andy, came to the Avery salvage yard and spoke to Steve. After meeting with Andy, Steve went to his vehicle and drove to the Dassey residence. Bob, Blaine, and Bobby were home at the time. Steve provided an affidavit on June the 29th, 2018. He stated the following in his affidavit regarding the events of the evening of November the 3rd. I stopped at my sister, Barb Dassey Yander's property and broke open a cut on the outside of the middle finger of my right hand as I was attempting to unhitch her trailer for her. I went to Barb's door to see if any of her sons wanted to go with me to Menards. Bobby and Blaine were home. I asked Bobby and Blaine if they wanted to go with me and my brother, Chuck, to Menards. I told both of them that a law enforcement officer had just left the property after asking me questions about Teresa's visit to photograph Barb's van on Halloween. I noticed that Bobby was immediately nervous after I mentioned the visit by the officer. He said that he could not go with me to Menards and that he had things to do. There is no doubt in my mind that Bobby saw that my finger was bleeding. There was no doubt in my mind that Bobby saw that my finger was bleeding. My memory is that Blaine said that he wanted to go to Menards and he went with Chuck and me. Prior to leaving for Menards, I returned to my trailer to put tape on my bleeding finger. A large amount of blood dripped onto the rim and sink and the floor of the bathroom. I did not wash away or wipe up because Chuck was waiting for me to go to Menards in Manitrock with him. While we were leaving the Avery property, driving a flatbed truck to Menards in Manitrock, I saw taillights in front of my trailer. The taillights were further apart and higher off the ground than sedan taillights. I told my brother, who was driving, about the taillights. We turned around and drove to my trailer, but the vehicle was gone. On November the 4th, I woke up at 6 a.m. and went into the bathroom to take a shower. I saw that most of the blood on my sink, which I had not cleaned up the previous night, was gone. It seemed to me that the blood had been cleaned up. After reviewing more case documents and thinking about what happened on November the 3rd, I do not believe that law enforcement broke into my trailer and took blood from my sink and planted it in Teresa's vehicle. No, they're capable of far more despicable things than planting your blood, Steve. Now, according to Mr. Avery, he left his door unlocked when he went to Menards. However, the Dasseys also had a key to his residence. Steve told law enforcement and trial defense counsel that as he was leaving his property around 7 o'clock and exiting onto Highway 147, he observed taillights of a vehicle close to his trailer. Mr. Avery also told trial defense counsel that he noticed that his blood had been removed from his sink when he entered his bathroom early in the morning of November the 4th. Obviously, the thing about taillights, it would seem to me, unless anybody's got another idea, that perhaps that the taillights were of Teresa's RAV4 because it wasn't a sedan, it was a car that was slightly higher up, and as you know, these SUVs are a bit higher up. And of course, fresh blood in the sink. Why did Bobby get nervous? Because he knew that was his opportunity to do what he was supposed to do, and that was to create even more planting evidence against Steve. Okay, let's move on then. Oh, too aggressive then. Bobby's direct link to the murder of Teresa. The third and final prong of the Denny test asks whether there is evidence that the alleged third-party perpetrator actually committed the crime, directly or indirectly. The Sawinski evidence demonstrates that Bobby could have committed the murder because he is in possession of Teresa's vehicle where the murder likely occurred, as evidenced by Teresa's blood in the vehicle. The vehicle is a key piece of evidence in the crime. Evidence of state party guilt admissible when an alternative suspect became connected to a key piece of evidence in the crime, the victim's purse, where the cancelled checks were found. Okay. The new evidence that Teresa's vehicle was returned to the salvage yard from a different location is corroborated by the fact that a witness saw a vehicle similar to Teresa's leave the property on October the 31st. In Steve's trial, Mr. LeQuinn, a propane driver, testified that he saw a green mid-size SUV leaving the Avery salvage yard driving towards Highway 147 between 3:30 and 4 o'clock on October the 31st. He informed law enforcement about this when he was stopped at a roadblock a few days later and had heard about the news of Teresa being missing. Further, it is corroborated by Bobby's brother Blaine's account. On June 25th, 2018, Bobby's brother, Blaine, provided Steve's current post-conviction counsel with an affidavit attesting. On October the 31st, 2005, when the school bus driver brought Brendan and me home as we travelled west on 147, I saw Bobby on 147 in a bluish or greenish vehicle heading towards Mishicot. Bobby was not driving his black Blazer. Bobby was not home the rest of the evening while I was home. Affidavit of Blaine. Bobby's trial testimony contradicts Blaine's affidavit because Bobby testified that he was home at 5 p.m. Bobby was with Mike Osmondson when Teresa's vehicle was discovered on November the 5th, 2005. Current post-conviction counsel's investigator met with and interviewed Osmondson about whether he was the individual with Bobby pushing the RAV4 onto the Avery salvage yard. The interview was conducted because Osmondson fits the height, weight, and beard description provided by Mr. Sawinski of the individual helping Bobby push the car. Yeah, he certainly fits the height, weight, and beard, certainly not the age, but then we do know that Sawinski did not get a very good view of Bobby's accomplice. When Mike was asked if he was the individual who helped Bobby push the vehicle on the Avery property on November the 5th, Mike responded that he, quote, could not remember if he was that individual. Wow. It's like, he's not saying, oh, no, it can't be me because I had absolutely nothing to do with it. No, he actually incriminates himself, doesn't he? Oh, I can't remember. It might have been me. Wow. Further evidence of Bobby's dishonesty. Bobby never reported to law enforcement the alleged statement Steve said to Bobby and Mike about whether they wanted to help him get rid of a body. Combined reports, re-interviews of Bobby Darcy. This was a major issue at trial. Trial defense counsel moved for a mistrial, pointing out that they had never been apprised of Bobby's new claim. During Bobby's direct examination, Prosecutor Kratz asked Bobby, now Bobby, on the 3rd of November, that would be a Thursday, I believe, do you recall having a conversation with your Uncle Steve regarding a body? And Bobby responded, yes. On cross-examination, Bobby testified that Mr. Avery stated this remark about getting rid of a body in jest on November the 3rd, when he and Osmondson were in his garage. However, Osmondson told law enforcement that Steve made such a statement to them on Thursday, November the 10th. Impossible. The only time Osmondson was at the Dassey residence between October the 31st and November the 11th, when he and Bobby were inside the Dassey garage and Steve came over. This claim is unequivocally false, since Mr. Steve Avery was arrested on November the 9th, could not have been there on November the 11th. Remarkably, Osmondson stated to law enforcement that he first learned about the missing girl on Tuesday, November the 1st, when Teresa had not yet been reported missing. Further, the record reveals that Osmondson and Bobby were either suspiciously calling each other repeatedly or with each other at relevant times after Teresa's murder. Bobby's phone records reflect that on October the 31st, there were 7 phone calls between Bobby and Osmondson, occurring between the following times in the morning and evening: 6:12, 6:36, 3:56, 3:57, 4:53, 5:10, and 6:01. Bobby's phone records reveal that Bobby called Osmondson a total of 66 times from October 24th to November the 6th. The Sawinski evidence, and of course the inference there is, of course, that it's 6:36 and then a big gap till 3:56. Why were they not phoning each other during that time? Some of that time they could have been together. Anyway, the Sawinski evidence is newly discovered and directly links Bobby to Teresa's murder because, as previously stated, Teresa's RAV4 was a key piece of evidence in her murder. The evidence is not cumulative. The Sawinski evidence provides, for the first time, the missing direct connection to Bobby as a third-party suspect for Teresa's murder and is therefore not cumulative. Reasonable doubt as to Steve's guilt. If the defendant satisfies all 4 criteria of newly discovered evidence, the reviewing court then examines whether it is reasonably probable that, had the jury heard the newly discovered evidence, it would have had a reasonable doubt as to the defendant's guilt. State versus Plude. This presents a question of law. a reasonable probability of a different outcome exists if there is a reasonable probability that a jury, looking at both the old evidence and the new evidence, would have a reasonable doubt as to the defendant's guilt. Overwhelming evidence against the defendant may not serve as the basis for excluding evidence of a third party's opportunity or direct connection to the crime. By evaluating the strength of only one party's evidence, no logical conclusion can be reached regarding the strength of contrary evidence offered by the other side to rebut or cast doubt. If Bobby is established as a viable third-party Denny suspect, the forensic evidence in this case is completely undermined. The newly discovered evidence that Bobby was in possession of Teresa's vehicle means that he had the opportunity and access to plant evidence in the vehicle and from the vehicle, because Bobby has been directly linked to the murder of Teresa Holbert. There is a reasonable inference that he planted the bones in Steve's burn pit. This new evidence creates a reasonable probability that, had the jury heard the new evidence, it would have had a reasonable doubt as to the defendant's guilt. Therefore, Mr. Avery should be granted a new trial. I'm going to hold it there. I'm going to keep it nice and short. It's again, it's one of these things that, you know, Kathleen Zellner, Stephen Avery should be granted a new trial. But by now, the state of Wisconsin, having watched Making a Murderer and having then seen the evidence, obviously in Series 2, that Kathleen Zellner has developed, the state of Wisconsin should have said, we have no faith in this conviction of Steve and Brendan. We're going to release them until we have, the satisfactory evidence to prove they're guilty, which obviously they're never going to have. And they should be saying, we're going to investigate this, and if necessary, bring in an outside agency to investigate. But of course, to me, that's probably what caused the problem in the first place, was the fact that had Stephen Avery's lawsuit, civil suit, gone through, making Vogel Kasurik bankrupt, because as we know, the insurers wouldn't have covered the kind of corruption that they were involved in, then that would have created the need for some sort of investigation of the goings on in Manitowoc. And of course, we know how diabolical some of the people in Manitowoc are, having obviously had the pleasure of Dave Begotka coming and telling us himself personally about the club and about how he was pressurized into joining it to such an extent that they then eventually closed down his business and forced him out of Manitowoc. But anyway, no, I mean, we've just seen, obviously, in Adnan Syed's case, that once new people come in and look at the evidence rationally, not trying to protect people, not trying to save face, trying to do the right thing, that yes, these situations can be overturned. One hopes that, obviously, in the case of Steve and Brendan, that we will start to see movement from the state with regards to their sort of obstinacy that, no, they were found guilty, therefore we're sticking to that opinion, and we're going to do our damnedest to ensure that they stay exactly where they are, which of course is partly fueled by the fact that when Teresa went missing and there was the investigation and Steve gets arrested, then you have the Brendan's press conference. Steve and Brendan were made out to be the most evil killers the world has ever seen, and some people in Manitowoc in particular, but Wisconsin in general, and even in the United States, have difficulty getting their heads around the fact that that they were framed, they're just going to have difficulty with that concept. Anyway, let's stop that. I'm going to say cheerio. Going to break up the next part in slightly more digestible bits rather than an hour at a time. I realized that the first part, although we only got through 24 pages, was an hour long. A bit too long to have to sit and listen to me havering on, as the dude would say. Anyway, take care all, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.